Hello everyone, my name is AJ Rappaport, aka Spoopy. I use they, them pronouns. And I am so excited to be here today to talk to you about beloved game Super Smash Bros. Melee and its illustrious esports scene. A lot of today's presentation is derived from my book, Melee is Broken, Super Smash Bros. Melee, an interdisciplinary esports ethnography, adapted from my master's thesis. If anything in today's presentation interests you, you can find my book at spoopy.ca/book. A little bit about me before we dive into it. I'm an artist, writer, tattooer, and gamer from Toronto, Canada. I did a BFA in Studio Arts at Concordia University in Montreal, where I took every video game class I could. Already an avid gamer, during my undergrad, I honestly became a little obsessed with competitive Super Smash Bros. Melee, also known as SSBM. There I met Dr. Darren Werschler, who invited me to do an individualized master's program where essentially you carve out your own research program. My immersion in this unique community naturally lent itself to an ethnographic approach to my research. As an artist, my work almost always takes many forms, bringing together my own artistic creations, analysis, and research. After graduating, I decided to adapt my thesis for the public consumption with the help of fellow Smash player, friend, and excellent writer, Nicole Bennett, and thus Melee is Broken was born. The book was released in November of 2020 during the deep pandemic lockdown, where SSBM players were desperately missing and craving the in-person tournaments they had come to know and love. So, how did competitive SSBM come to be so special and popular? Well, the year was 2001, which was an amazing year for media, especially video games. Not only did we see the release of iconic movies like Shrek and The Lord of the Rings, let's go, but also epic games like Halo and Final Fantasy X. However, near the end of 2001, Nintendo released their second iteration in the Smash Bros. Franchise, a game that would forever change the lives of many, Super Smash Bros. Melee. SSBM is a platform-based fighting game, boasting a wide variety of Nintendo characters and IP, in an attempt to broaden the game's fan base. SSBM presented strong fluid hybridity in gameplay, especially compared to the first entry in the series, Super Smash Bros. For the Nintendo 64. Offering players new and exciting elements like virtual collectibles, more battle items, a significant increase in gameplay modes, and so much more than the first game was ever able to offer. To be able to understand what makes SSBM a unique case for esports, it is important to cover how gameplay works. 1 to 4 players can simultaneously duke it out, playing as any of the 26 Nintendo characters included on stages modeled from the series that each character hails from. Unlike traditional fighting games like Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat, where players attempt to deplete their opponent's health bar to 0, SSBM requires that players inflict number-based damage represented as a percentage. The higher a player's percentage, the further they will be knocked back when their opponent hits them. The goal of the battle is to knock one opponent out of the boundaries of the stage to take a life. Here, each life a player takes is referred to as a stock. However, the game has its own gravity system, as well as different weights for each characters. Finally, unlike other fighting games where moves are predefined combinations of button inputs, moves for SSBM are formed by single button presses, accompanied at most by a single directional input. This chaotic but unique, exciting gameplay, as well as the nostalgia for the game and the Nintendo IP experienced by many players over the course of its 2-decade lifespan, is what sparks the initial intrigue for SSBM for many players. Unlike the more gore-driven fighting games, SSBM seemed more accessible to youth through the inclusion of likable and arguably cute Nintendo characters. The inclusion of cuteness and accessible IP was very intentional by SSBM's director, Masahiro Sakurai. Sakurai's intention was for SSBM to be a casual, family-friendly game that all generations could sit down and enjoy together. Spoiler, this is not how the game was received. Sakurai has since stated that the way SSBM players today use the game doesn't align with the series' value, nor is it consistent with Nintendo's broader philosophy, which positions games for casual fun rather than competitive play. Until the 5th installment of community-ran Apex eSports tournament in 2014, Nintendo actively denied any form of support to the competitive SSBM scene, and even has historically reacted unusually antagonistic to SSBM as an eSport. This long-standing tension between SSBM players base and its developer runs contrary to most esports, which are designed not only for competitive play, but are often enthusiastically supported by the developers and the companies that made them. This is just one of the many reasons as to why SSBM is a very unique and special case for esports. Today we will examine SSBM's hardware and software, as well as how players approach competitive play and community participation in an attempt to summarize and understand its uniqueness as an esports and the competitive community. Controversy aside for a moment, another key element that sets SSBM apart from other esports is players' continued reliance on hardware objects from the early 2000s. These objects include chunky cathode ray tube or CRT televisions, specific gaming consoles, and one's own personal controller. Players' adherence to these strict three central hardwares has led to the development of specific tinkering and modding practices. The fundamentals of requiring a screen, controller, and console are common to many esports, but SSBM requires these specific objects, which have never been changed, updated, or altered by the hands of the game's developers. The onus falls on players to create their own patches, mods, and additions to the game, which in turn strengthens the competitive SSBM's unique sense of community. Media scholar Charles Ackland notes that the internet plays a crucial role in communities like SSBM. It allows new media to enclose the old. This is to say that the internet allows the community to thrive and connect while extending the lifespan of otherwise considered dead hardware objects. When players choose what game to play, they implicitly agree to a specific set of hardware objects and abide by these tacit community-developed rules for them, which in turn dictates how their bodies act during competitive play. Friend and scholar Alex Custodio argues in their study of the Game Boy Advance as a platform, stating that embodied experiences of engaging with gaming hardware is fundamental to the way people actively engage with objects. SSBM players are expected to acquire, learn, and understand a variety of practices and materials. These practices are inseparable from the community or social capital. In participating in these practices cements people's identities as SSBM players. So, if acquiring, learning, and using these hardware are fundamental to the player's engagement, what makes them so special? Why do SSBM players still love CRTs across the country? Is this gameplay portability the reason why the GameCube was designed with a handle? Well, let's take a look at the three required hardwares. To begin, the CRT Television is arguably the heart of the competitive SSBM experience. The CRT takes up a lot of symbolic and real-life space, contributing to some of Melee Tournament's most visually and audibly prominent physical indicators. The CRT Television is built to display high-contrast video and notably can only receive analog signals. When the game dropped into stores in 2001, it was a time before liquid crystal display or LCD televisions. The Nintendo GameCube was designed to output analog signal, and of course, this was a perfect match for the CRT, the only available hardware display at the time of its release. Since LCD monitors started to become available, players have refused to switch because LCD displays cause lag. CRT displays SSBM gameplay at 60 frames per second with little to no lag, period. Frames are the smallest and shortest measure of time for many serious gamers. SSBM displays gameplay at 60 frames per second, where frames are consecutive images displayed in a second to create an animation. For SSBM, lag is the time between a player's input on a controller and when the corresponding in-game frame appears on screen. Here, you can see an example of how fast frames come and go, using playable character Captain Falcon's jab as an example. Many players study frame data habitually, thus becoming hyper-aware to changes in frame rate or display. Competitive SSBM players are remarkably sensitive to lag, as their in-game movement has a small margin of error. A single frame can be the deciding factor between triumph or defeat. While the CRT Television hasn't been in production since 2008, the CRT remains the preferred community-wide standard for play. This deep obsession with maintaining a consistent standard throughout 2 decades of competitive play distinguishes SSBM from almost every other esports community where new technologies are more commonly adopted. Finding, collecting, and traveling with the CRT Television could be considered a rite of passage for many players, aligning them with SSBM by means of acquiring this otherwise outdated hardware. The next required tool for play is the gaming console. Ever since Nintendo stopped manufacturing the GameCube in 2007, never mind copies of SSBM, finding the console with a copy of the GameCube disc has become increasingly difficult and expensive. The game alone is typically sold for about $80 USD on sites like eBay. However, the introduction of the GameCube's successor, the Wii, provided a discounted solution without sacrificing the 480p progressive scan that the competitive standard requires. The Wii console, released in 2006, is able to run GameCube discs natively and includes 4 GameCube ports, 2 USB ports, a slot for a GameCube memory card, and finally, an SD card slot. These inclusions heralded opportunities for programmers and lovers of SSBM alike. With these points of access, players could now load a ROM, aka a game's entire software, copied from a GameCube disc to run on the Wii. With this, players were quick to run SSBM software on a Wii using a modified SD card. Plugging this custom setup into our CRT gives players the experience of lagless play, but now with more accessibility. Players began to develop, share, and circulate information of software mods which not only allowed for quicker access to SSBM, but whether consciously or not, cemented the knowledge of these mods as requirements for participation in the community at large. A few of these Wii modding practices might include SD card formatting, emulating software, how and where to download various community-developed training packs like 20XX or Uncle Punch, all of which required little to no programming knowledge to actually employ. As a result, SSBM players have come to value the Wii as much, if not more, than the GameCube in terms of its potential for competitive play, accessibility, and community additions. One particular iteration of the game's software became arguably more impactful than the rest. As previously discussed, competitive SSBM demands specific hardware and in-person gameplay. Before the pandemic started, there was an online matchmaking system called Anther's Ladder. This allowed players to connect online through emulating SSBM on their home computers using a piece of software called Dolphin, sacrificing lagless play for home access. While it was a very useful tool, it remained vastly inferior to the in-person play because of its delay-based netcode. This drastically changed when community developer Fizzy, with major contributions from programmers Uncle Punch, Nikki, and Metaconstruct, developed and released Project Slippy, now fondly referred to just as Slippy. Slippy's development began in 2018, but was not made publicly available until June 2020. The program could not have come at a better time. Slippy revolutionized online gameplay for SSBM, giving players a replay system, live mirroring that allowed high-quality streaming of gameplay, integrated matchmaking without the need for external applications or websites, and most notably, rollback netcode. Rollback netcode is the gold standard for online fighting gameplay. It allows for games to be played despite players being far away with almost zero latency. When Slippy was made public in 2020, it not only allowed players to connect with and play with others in a time of deep isolation, but made the game extremely accessible to newcomers who would only need a controller adapter, and computer to play online. It marks a major milestone for the Melee community. And just under a month ago, a beta release of the long-awaited ranked matchmaking system debuted/came out. The final tool for gameplay is the GameCube controller. The body's most prominent tactile connection to the game is through one's controller. The GameCube controller has an iconic shape that players adapt their body to in order to fit their specific playstyles. Most commonly, players hold the controller in both palms, but some players may rest their whole hand atop the controller, executing what's called a claw or half-claw grip, emulating the grip more commonly seen in fight stick controllers in the fighting game community at large. Some players don't even play with their hands. Notably, I recall Charmazel, who plays with her feet, or picture Japanese competitor Rudolph, who arranges 3 chairs in a row to assume a lying down position. These are both examples of how players adjust their bodies to suit their idea of optimized gameplay. In the pursuit of optimization, players have begun to develop some alternative controllers. Most popular are the box-style controllers. These controllers kind of look like a nicer pizza box with buttons. They look like fight stick controllers, but they only have buttons, so players can have the box rest atop their lap without having to bend their wrists as much to deal with the joysticks that the GameCube has. The legality and tournament of the box controllers is a little bit up in the air, but many players have adopted them and have not looked back. Because while the GameCube controller is beloved by many, it doesn't come without issues. A common issue of the GameCube controller is called snapback. Put simply, controllers with bad snapback will register button inputs that are not happening, which is unacceptable at high-level play. Unfortunately, many of controllers are affected by issues such as snapback, and controller model Typo has estimated that over 60% of controllers are unfit for competition. To address this issue, programmer Dan Salvato created Universal Controller Fix, or UCF. UCF addresses the lack of availability of controllers to level the playing field. Eventually, modders put UCF right onto a GameCube memory card. However, fear of legal retaliation from Nintendo pressured players to find hardware solutions that could more easily circumvent Nintendo's historic disdain for the game software modding. In response to this, players sprung back to hardware mods to evade Nintendo. Players developed a hardware mod using a single-board microcontroller manufactured by open-source electronics platform Arduino that is inserted into all 4 GameCube controller ports on a console, which adds UCF to gameplay directly through the controller's connection. Some players ahead of the curve decided to use Arduino by directly inserting that single-board microcontroller into their own controller. Some players even used this discrete hardware mod to achieve consistently augmented and frame-perfect inputs. Technically, tool-assisted gameplay in a competitive setting is considered illegal, but it's proven difficult to enforce these rules without having players open their controller on the spot. Many of these Arduino additions have not seen public use since the release of Slippy, which includes most of the fixes to the original SSBM software that the community now requires as standard. There is still a variety of hardware mods being done to the classic GameCube controller, most recently the insertion of a fob, an open source technology that uses magnetic sensors to measure stick positions instead of potentiometers. As well, box-style controllers continue to be adopted by many, but the high-quality ones specific for Melee, like Greg Turbo's Frame 1, become increasingly hard to find because they are widely desired but produced by a very small company. The final thing worth noting in regards to the controller is that besides modifying it for performance, many modify their controller to suit their personal aesthetics or sense of style. Endless controller mods for custom shells, buttons, wires, LEDs have become more adopted by many, myself included, as a way to express themselves and their passion and commitment to playing SSBM competitively. In his discussion of materiality, Matthew Kirschenbaum states, "Materiality rests upon the principle of individualization. This is to say that no two physical objects are the same by the nature of how our bodies and identities experience and use them." And for SSBM, the case for each required hardware use is deeply specific, individualized, and the cornerstone for all competitive play. I'm going to take a sip. With the fundamental hardware is now defined, let's talk a little bit about discourse. Discourse is the language and attitudes used by players or of a specific group to convey knowledge and alignment with a group. Here, the competitive SSBM community. SSBM players' identities, values, and even careers are molded by active participation in the community's network. Michel Foucault's approach to discourse emphasizes how discourse operates in tandem with power relations. Discourse creates context and deems what is possible to say or not say about distinct times and spaces. What a community brings to a discourse, as well as what they omit, of what determines what is good, bad, allowed, or not allowed for the participants of a given community. In examining how discourse is formed within the competitive SSBM community, I turned to Janice Radway's approach to studying interpretive communities of a group with a centralized passion. Radway studied romance readers, and I applied that same framework to SSBM players. Especially in the case of SSBM, where competitors mostly compete alone, as opposed to team-based games, opinions and ideas are given to a community are not immune to the influences of a person's background and experiences. Of course, the creation of discourse does not come without controversy. As Radway writes, interpretive communities may not simply differ over what to do with metaphors, they may disagree even more fundamentally over the nature and purpose of reading or gaming itself. In the competitive SSBM community, as in many other gaming communities, the nature and purpose of gaming itself is a frequent topic of debate. And boy, do I know that gamers love to debate the right and wrong ways to play and engage with any game, no less SSBM. Radway also asserts that the meaning of a text is a result of complex and ever-evolving structures and interactions between a fixed text and a reader. I argue that Nintendo's reluctance to update, change, or align with the competitive discourse creates a subversive discourse shaped by the players instead of the developer. Ultimately, when players participate in the competitive SSBM community, they internalize the discourse around it. It influences how they talk and what they talk about. Discourse regulates players' activities and even thoughts. The lexicon of words and phrases unique to the discourse of SSBM can reveal patterns in identity performance, as well as positions, opinions, and alignments players might have. One popular example of the competitive SSBM vernacular is the use of the word broken. To call a character, move, interaction, or instance broken is to call it overpowered or simply too good. Broken is not a term of negative connotation, however, quite the opposite. It can speak to the excitement, intensity, and hype. Learning a new meaning to the word broken was something that happened to me very early in my time playing SSBM, which became deeply cemented in my vernacular to the extent that I used it in the title of my book. Lexicon aside, the discourse for gameplay concerning what is broken or not can reveal how SSBM players think and what they expect. SSBM is notoriously a very technical, difficult game. It can take players years to develop their in-game skill. For example, SSBM discourse categorizes playstyles as aggressive or campy. In-game, when players throw out as many hitboxes as possible and consistently approach, this could be considered a rushdown or aggressive style of gameplay. On the other hand, slower, more patient gameplay is often referred to as campy. It is as if the player has set up camp at one end of the stage, waiting patiently for their opponent to make a mistake that presents them with the opportunity to exploit a weakness. This slower-paced, reluctant-to-approach strategy can be extremely successful, as it kept Team Liquid's Hungrybox at the #1 spot for 3 consecutive years. However, many players see campy gameplay as uncool, which not only reveals that community discourse, but also implies the expectation that the game is meant to be spectated. While players have many expectations of how gameplay should look or feel, there could be no competitive gameplay without the structure that a universal rule set provides. One of the earliest rules to be formed was the expectations for items to be turned off. Items in the Smash Bros. Franchise are different hazards, buffs, and debuffs, crucially, are all randomized. The random interference with encounters of 2 players fighting against each other led to turning off items becoming a non-negotiable requirement for all forms of competitive play, whether in tournament or casual matches between players, also known as friendlies. The universal rules expect players to begin with 4 stocks and an in-game timer set to 8 minutes. The match ends either when one player's stocks are depleted or in a timeout when the 8-minute timer finishes before the eradication of one player's stock count. The notion that timeouts aren't hype or exciting to watch implies SSBM's cultural expectation for fast and exciting gameplay, and ultimately the expectation that competitive SSBM play should cater to both the players and the audience. Moreover, most rule sets insist on only 6 of the game's 29 stages being legal. They are perceived as the most neutral stages with the least number of elements that could affect the match outside of the player's control. Generally, the stages are flat, sometimes with 2 to 3 platforms, some of which move. There are some differences in scale and proportion between the 6 stages. Notably, Final Destination is the only stage to have no platforms, but generally, they're similar enough to roughly standardize the competitive landscape. All that said, things do change over time, and rules are debated time and time again. Esteemed esports scholar T.L. Taylor writes, "Rules are not fixed, for they are evolutionary systems that grow alongside the ongoing construction of the performance of play. Changes in rule sets, like those recorded on beloved forums Smash boards, to those on official websites of major tournaments in SSBM's history, like EVO 2015, show how Discourse has evolved over the years." Despite the creation and acceptance of the universal rules for gameplay, there are still conditions that arrive that are left up to the discretion of more individual forces. SSBM's grassroots nature lacks a central authority structure. Power and responsibility for SSBM comes from Discourse, but without a central authority like the developers or parent company that so many other esports have, many issues evade unanimously approved decisions. So, where does power come from for SSBM, and how is it used? Tournament organizers put on events that make the scene possible at all. They rent venues, put together brackets, inflate rule sets, all while juggling players' questions, submissions, and expectations. Occasionally, it takes a whole team of people to run this often thankless yet essential role. The TO's immense responsibility to the community can also often place them as central points of attack for disappointed or contentious players. Other teams, such as Community Hub website May Lay It On Me, or the now disbanded SSB Code of Conduct, or COC, also contributed to the discourse of what is allowed and not allowed in the competitive SSBM space, expanding the discussion beyond the in-game rules to include regulation of behavior and social conduct. There have been countless instances of harmful, if not outright, abusive behavior in the competitive Smash scene that have led to bans enforced by the COC on specific players to ensure the safety of others. Due to the lack of centralized structure for competitive SSBM, there have been instances where banned players have been given permission to compete at certain events by the TOs who disagreed with the COC's decision, which in turn led to the undermining of the power and influence of these entities. Ultimately, unable to handle the weight and the burden alongside with verbal attacks and abuse towards its members, the COC disbanded recently. The COC worked incredibly hard to ensure the safety of others at events, and this work will continue to have a deep impact on the discussion of power and safety in the competitive SSBM community. Players in the community can derive power and responsibility from how they perform and act in the competitive space. It is useful to look at Carolyn Marvin's study of the rise of the electrician in the early 20th century as a useful case study that speaks to how experts in a given community emerge. Marvin explains that experts arose from new forms of accreditation developed by the textual community of a given trade independently rather than by an academy or a guild. These new self-supported modes of analysis shape the idea of an expert in the pursuit of universalized or proper standards for the electrician, just as for electrifying gameplay. SSBM players define themselves as experts by participating in online forums, writing and interacting with gameplay guides, producing content and testimonials, tutorials, and anecdotes. One example of this is popular YouTube channel SSBM Tutorials, which teaches beginners techniques and discourse around gameplay. SSBM players have become experts through their own creation of these specific technological literacy. Often, these experts frame technological literacy as it pertains to the game with a neutral or objective attitude and act as if it can only be attained through one's skill or talent with no influence from the individual functions of one's identity. This paints an incomplete picture of how expertise is cultivated in the scene. Similar beliefs of expert neutrality can be observed in relation to the history of computing. Technology and gender historian Marie Hicks writes, "Perhaps the most important fiction in history of computing is the concept of meritocracy, or that technology acts as an equalizing force in society. Participating in SSBM, even online, does not fully erase the participating impact of one's identity, ability to claim success or expertise. I write in my book, the microcosm of competitive SSBM is not isolated from the outside world. If anything, it's a small scale that lends itself to reflecting and magnifying existing issues of identity and impression. As has been seen and demonstrated by scholar Kashana L. Gray's research on Black women participating in online gaming forums, gender minorities, and/or people of color, that they take with them aspects of their physical selves and are sometimes punished for not conforming to the white male default operating within technology. The presence of real-world identifiers can sometimes lead to oppression and inequality. With this, it's not sufficient to say that those who claim expertise in SSBM through having achieved exceptional technological literacy are able to stake the claim that it was through skill or talent alone, or that the authority of these experts create for themselves is solely a result of their in-game skill. Many players who present as experts spend time assigning names, labels, and signs to things which can often be used as a means to sway others' alignment to their own personal discourse that they believe should be applied to SSBM at large. On a final note, I'd examine the roles that experts play in the depictions of SSBM's history. The SSBM community is deeply invested in narrativizing its own history. There have been copious documentary-style coverage, notably Travik's, Samok's, Bouchamp's 8-part docuseries, The Smash Brothers, or Prague and Gangley's docuseries, Lackstock Legends. While it is important to preserve the history of such a special group, content creators attempting to document and narrativize SSBM's history take on a gigantic responsibility of presenting the community's discourse, both to itself and to the outside world. Of course, it is impossible to try to cover every aspect of such an intense community through media-based reporting and writing alone. As a result, when the spotlight is given to SSBM's most prominent self-professed experts, this can often lead to the true diversity of the community being left out. Despite engaging with the game deeply, many community members who do not conform to the unfortunately often gendered expectation of not only what an expert should look like, but what a competitive or community member should look like. These projections of SSBM's history and discourse inherently indicate what serious competitors are expected to look like and present. Many of these identities continue to be overlooked in the narrativization of SSBM's competitive history because of the real-world identifiers that can sometimes lead to oppression and inequality, as noted by Kashana L. Gray's study earlier. While today in 2023, the representation of more identities are starting to surface for competitive SSBM, there is still a long way to go to have all identities feel welcome and safe in the community at large, but also too specifically in the expert community. Similar to our discussion of discourse, scholar Raymond Williams explains that analyzing techniques of a given culture can expose where values lie. These values are kept alive through repetition, social inheritance, and embodiment, and are proven universal when they are learned. Techniques become real or actualized through the community's expectation to perform them. Analyzing one technique can reveal others and speak to the nature of the group as a whole. Moreover, because of Nintendo's adversity towards the competitive scene, all socio-technological infrastructure is made by the players for the players, an extremely unique case for eSport. eSports scholar T.L. Taylor coined the term co-creation to express how the maintenance of a game is not the sole responsibility of the developers, but rather a shared responsibility between players, developers, and the technologies that perpetuate a sort of collaborative ecosystem. Co-creation is arguably the foundation of SSBM, entirely supported by the players and their technologies, with little to no help from the game's developers. Looking at specific techniques within SSBM culture can reveal not only the systems of behavior and play that players value, but also how and why players adopt certain techniques. These revealing techniques can be seen in and out of game. The in-game technique list continues to grow even today in 2023 as players continue to exploit and remix ways of playing competitively. Notably, one of the most well-known competitive techniques for SSBM is the wave dash. To be brief, a wave dash is a positioning tool executed using 3 inputs: X or Y to jump, L or R to shield, and a downward diagonal input on the analog stick. This technique requires a lot of practice to execute, but is a crucial positioning tool for almost any serious player. Techniques like the wave dash reveal that players deeply value positioning, speed, and movement as an imperative for optimal play. The list of in-game techniques can feel endless, but players are eager to learn and adopt these techniques once they commit to SSBM. They often narrow this task by generally committing to one character, what SSBM players call their main, and spending countless hours practicing. Techniques are learned and internalized through practice, consisting of repeating the timing, spacing, and inputs of various moves until they are ingrained and tacit in one's muscle memory. Learning such techniques can be a means of understanding both what is important to oneself and the community as a whole. Choosing one's main is one of the first forms of self-expression through competitive play. Less than 10 characters have been deemed viable for competition according to the community-developed tier list, although many challenge this and manage to excel with characters considered lower tier. Each character has their own affordances like weight, speed, moveset, frame data, overall flow, and of course, aesthetic. More often than not, one's choice of main influences how are they perceived and judged by other players before even reaching a screen. While technique players choose to utilize in their game can signify their values, this is also true for the techniques outside of gameplay. The social techniques for SSBM are far from immune to influences of the outside world, which we talked a little bit about earlier. For decades, in the United States, advertising for video games has historically targeted a specific demographic: male, heterosexual, white, cisgender, and middle class. This targeted advertising has presumed the default identity of a gamer being strongly associated with men in particular. Although there have been many efforts to create space in SSBM for gender minorities, a large majority of SSBM players themselves are heterosexual cisgender men, if not also white and middle class. The homogeneity presented in SSBM players has profoundly impacted the construction of masculinities within the context of SSBM, as well as how gender and SSBM interact on a larger scale. Techniques of masculinities are constructed and performed repeatedly for SSBM players, which inherently create expectations as to what players expect others to look like. This sameness and subsequent unification and bonding through uniformity is a key facet of Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick's definition of homosociality. A male homosocial environment is a male-dominated kinship system characterized by the prioritization of male friendship, mentorship, entitlement rivalry, and interactions concerning hetero and homosexuality. When masculinity is constructed or enacted in such an environment, it usually is to the benefit of other men in an effort to gain validation from other men. Often a consequence of the homosocial male environment is the construction of patriarchy, which will continue to oppress, marginalize, and tokenize and other people who fall outside of the homogeneity desired by the insular community. However, there have been amazing strides, especially in recent years, of techniques to resist and break down the closed gates of the homosocial environment. To challenge the homosociality present in SSBM culture, players have turned to subverting existing community traditions. The crew battle is a long-standing tradition for SSBM, where an evenly numbered crews send in players to battle one-on-one until one crew runs out of stocks. 2017 marked the beginning of Smash Sisters, headed by long-term SSBM players and community members Milk Tea and Emily Waves. Smash Sisters is a side event of crew battles for women and gender minorities to meet, gather, and enjoy competitive play together. Subsequently, the formation of Gaily, a group of LGBTQIA folks, created a Discord server for queer Smash players. Gaily also runs a series of weekly tournaments, invitational, and other queer Smash events. Most recently, we have also seen the utilization and normalization of having players' pronouns on tournament streams overlays, which has been really awesome to see. Overall, there has been a lot more open discussion concerning the ways to make SSBM a more welcome space for all identities to succeed. In order to continue to resist homosocial techniques that bar others from success, all community members must not pretend like these issues do not exist, and continue to advocate, prioritize, and make space for everyone in SSBM. I could go on for hours about the intricacy of hardware, software, discourse, and technique for SSBM, but in an attempt to conclude with the notion of it matters to be here. For SSBM, being present is a key element of being part of the community. Although online social media platforms and most recently Slippy have allowed players to participate without being at the venue of the event, there's nothing parallel to experiencing SSBM offline and in person. Being a part of SSBM and of an SSBM event is so very special, and the hype and the passion of the dedicated players and fans is not something that can be ignored. The lived experience of attending an SSBM event is the actualization of someone's commitment to the game. And today, we shared a taste of this commitment by you all sitting here listening to me. It matters that you're here. So, continue to show up, not only for SSBM, but for the games you love. And I hope that you can take some of what I've talked about today and apply it to your own careers as gamers. Thank you. Thank you guys so much. Thank you, MAGFest, for having me. I think we have some time for a couple questions. I also have some stickers for after if anyone wants to grab one. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to sit up here. Or you can go enjoy this magnificent event. But overall, I can't thank you guys enough for being here. Yeah.
Question. So I love this idea of being able to like create expertise or find that when you have like a tightly knit community and everyone's signaling to like each other that this video or this person or this thing kind of represents expertise, right? But how do you kind of create like the idea of expertise in less tightly knit communities? Do you need the accreditation that you're talking about before, or is there kind of more like, again, not really relevant, but you know, what do you think about that?
I'm going to repeat the question because there's a piece of paper that told me to. So if I got it right, then the question is, how do you create expertise in smaller communities?
Or less, like perhaps larger but less tightly knit communities?
Perhaps larger or less tightly knit communities. So a part of my argument here is that people create expertise by simply performing it. So this can be a difficult thing because people will decide, hey, I know a lot about this thing and I feel very passionately about it, so I'm going to speak into the ether of social media and present as an expert. So I think it's quite easy for folks to get up on their big stage of Twitter, YouTube, what have you, and start putting out content that positions them as an expert to people who perceive them, which I think is a problem because that's when other important folks may get left behind, or worse, false information spreads. So I don't know if there's a right or wrong way to do it. A right way would be to cite your sources and make sure you're talking to as many people as you can about your topic of interest. But my argument, supported by like Michel Foucault, we mentioned earlier, is that people just perform it. It's something they make on their own. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, Jorge.
I was really interested in the way that you described the hardware, and it sort of made me reflect on the decisions that I make with my hardware. Mm-hmm. Could you just, in your experience, describe the ways that qualitative ways that we relate to, obviously the controllers look different ways and perform differently, but like the CRTs or consoles, what is sort of the function in your view, with our own identities, or the ways that we relate with that, if that makes sense?
So the question is, how does our identity function in tandem with the hardware we use?
Yeah, and then sort of in tandem.
Okay. So the most obvious way I see that happening is how people actualize themselves through aesthetic choices, specifically with the controller. We spoke a little bit about beautiful mods and buttons and shells and how people go on these endless pursuits to actualize their identity by maybe let's say I love Zelda, I'm going to put a Triforce on my controller. But we see that too in the choice of the hardware styles. So maybe, as a Melee player, I'm sure you're well aware that there's a very fiery debate about controller styles. We spoke about the box controllers versus the traditional GameCube controller earlier. So I think something that really signifies a lot of players as serious players is making the switch from the GameCube controller to the box, especially if a player has spent years and years and years only using the GameCube controller, and then they decide to make the switch, and that's like a whole public thing. And they make it public because they're signaling something about themselves. They're signaling, hey, I'm serious about this. I'm a competitive player. I'm gonna adapt this new hardware and be very public about it as a means of expressing my identity to other people. Of course, with the other hardware, I don't think there's as much to be represented with the console itself. Maybe you throw some stickers on it, like that's very cool, but more so with the CRT. So which player is showing up to the tournament with the CRT set up in their hotel room? Which player is adding wheels to their CRT so they can bring it with them wherever they go? All of the ways that we interact with the hardware signal to other people how seriously committed we are to this beautiful game, right? But I think one of the most obvious things that I think of, especially as an artist, is how people aesthetically align their controllers to their identities.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, in the back.
Yeah. Two questions. One, who's your main? And then two, you talk a lot about the community being sort of unified and homogenized for sort of white cishet males. Do you have anything to speak on for the community being a space for, at least in my experience, like Latino or other cultural groups, how that has sort of played into the development of the Super Smash Brothers team?
Okay, so I'm not that competitive anymore, but I play Sheik and Falco. Oh, they asked what my main was. So yeah, I play Sheik and Falco, and then asking me about perhaps to speak about other marginalized folks in the community and how they found space. So obviously, as a white person, I can't speak to the experiences of other marginalized groups. I can speak, as a queer person, I can see that there has been amazing strides towards welcoming other gender minorities and identities into the communities with things like we looked at earlier, Gaily. Most notably, I could also mention how Homemade Waffles runs a Black Empowerment tournament. I believe that's coming up very soon. That's very hype and cool. But like I said, I can't speak to these other communities because I'm not a part of them and I don't know the experience, but I do, things like with the invention of Smash Sisters, Gaily, and of course WAF's Black Empowerment Tournament, there are things being made. Like when I started playing this game in 2015, I felt so othered, I felt so uncomfortable. It was very difficult to just navigate public space. But it is improving, and especially now that Slippy's out, the community has probably tripled in size because the access has been made available. And of course, if access has been made available, it's going to bring in as many different identities as we can. And with that, I'm very hopeful that there will be strong identities who are able to carve more space for every identity to not only feel safe and welcomed, but also celebrated. And I really hope for that. And I think it's going to happen. I think we're getting there. Yes.
Who were the two creators you said of the Smash Sisters? I missed it.
The question was, who created Smash Sisters? That was Milk Tea and Emily Waves. They're both very epic humans. Very cool. Okay. No one else? Then thanks again. Oh, just kidding. Yeah, what's up?
How do you feel about Goom Waves, boxes, all that good stuff?
Oh, how do I feel about Goom Waves boxes? Goom Waves is the newest controller motherboard, but it's closed hardware, right? They're keeping it behind a gated door. As someone who isn't very competitively driven, I don't have an extreme polarizing opinion. It is a little bit entertaining to see the competitive players talk themselves in circles about it, but it is frustrating as someone who enjoys Melee as a spectator to see a lot of this animosity because information is just not being made readily available. With the Goom Wave specifically, to keep the information hidden or obscured, I think is kind of unfair to players, especially those who stake not only their competitive, but truly their careers on things like this. And without being able to have a legality to enforce those things or a way of even checking, is this a macro? Is this like, is this player actually inputting what's happening? It's very difficult, and I don't necessarily have an answer or a way of dealing with it head on. But I guess to sum up, I would say it's kind of entertaining because I like to, with Melee, it's been a long run for me, and I still, I always see a lot of new inventions, and that's, I think, what's very cool about the Goom Wave, controversy aside. It's something new, and I love that we're constantly breathing new life into otherwise dead hardware by the means of our participation. Yeah.
I guess it's a question more so a topic that I was informed about recently that I haven't really thought about. With this new introduction of these box controllers and the influence of box and boom waves, it further brings up the topic that I've heard a lot of where Melee in the competitive Smash as a whole is looking more and more like there's monetary gatekeeping, I guess we can put it. And I was wondering how you felt about that whole topic as far as the community goes, because in the past it used to not be as much of a deal at all. Before to go to your local, so you seem to be able to perform.
Is your question, how do I feel about monetary barriers in place in Smash?
Yes.
It's a good question. It is expensive to play, and it seems, you're right, it has gotten more expensive to acquire the materials. Specifically, we're looking at the controller now, like a CRT you can find on the side of the road, a Wii you can get online for $20, SD card, you're good to go. But it's truly the monetary value has been instilled in the controller. It is a little upsetting, but I also, it's not like building a PC, So there is some accessibility to it, but there's also some inaccessibility of it. And then, of course, we can return back to the discussion of controllers like Goom Waves being gate-kept. And then, of course, for something like Greg Turbo's Frame 1 controller, one of the most popular box styles controller in my opinion, it's really expensive and very, very limited. And then people will try to pawn off something they purchased, or I don't remember the word when you when something launches and you try and buy all of it so you can resell it. I think that's gross. Scalping, thank you. I think that's gross. I think it's unfortunate, but I think Melee, especially in 2023, is fairly inexpensive to get into, because if you're just looking to start playing Slippy online, you really just need that controller and the USB port, like the May Flash adapter, or the Wii U adapter, what have you, and then you're good to go, and I think that's really incredible. So that part I really like. Scalping is gross, don't do that, but I really, I think Melee has become more accessible in terms of a monetary value, but it is upsetting to see a lot of these players, especially the competitive ones, who dump loads and loads of money into a controller and then it breaks in 2 months, and then they're raging at the person who made the controller, and then there's a cycle of animosity that I don't like that. Because I'm a very positive, wholesome person. I want everyone to just be having fun all the time. But of course, you know how gamers are, you know how competitive gaming is. It's not the case. Do you have we have time for maybe one or more question? I don't know. If you guys have anything else. Yeah.
Do you want to play some Melee?
Do I want to play some Melee? Maybe I could play some. My controller's in my room. I did bring it. Where I think we'll.
Fantastic third-party controllers they have downstairs.
Oh yeah, they have. I've just been informed that they have fantastic third-party controllers downstairs. We also saw some flat-screen Melee in the arcade room, which we were okay, I guess, But as long as there's access and you can be playing. It's a privilege to play. So anytime you get to play, you have to be remembering that. It's a privilege to play video games in any capacity. So, be nice and welcome people into the space. But yeah, we can maybe play. I would play some doubles. I don't really not into the singles anymore. I have my doubles partner here too, so we're good for that. Teams? Doubles?
First game.
Okay, cool. Anyone else? Yes.
One more question.
Sure.
You think it's weird how vanilla Melee feels awful and they not playing the actual game?
The question is, do I think it's weird how vanilla Melee feels awful? In all honesty, my time as a competitor burnt out a couple years ago, especially as I started to lend myself to more of a different place in the community as a scholar and as a stage manager. I've run a couple tournaments too. I really like, personally likes participating in outside aspects of Melee. I do notice that vanilla Melee feels kind of icky, and playing on a monitor took me a while to getting used to, but now that I play Slippy, I like that. And like, I'm just like a really intense like JRPG player now, so that's kind of like where my allegiance lies these days. And definitely more of a spectator. But it is very interesting to, as someone who has been playing for so long, to see the way it feels different over the years. And of course, I've done different things to my controllers. I remove springs and my triggers, I put them back, and it always feels different, but the heart stays the same. Yeah. Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you guys, really. I'll probably have time for one more if you guys have it. Yay, okay, cool. Thank you guys so much. Game on, good luck, have fun. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, MAGFest.